August 10, 1944. Near Avranches, Normandy, France. The hedgerow smells of damp earth and crushed leaves. Smoke drifts low, clinging to the ground. Jeffrader Karl-Heinz Müller, 21st Panzer Division, presses his helmet deeper into his brow as artillery thuds somewhere to the west. The sound is different now, he knows that instinctively. Heavier. Continuous. American. His stomach cramps not from fear but from hunger. Karl-Heinz hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. The last ration truck never arrived. Yesterday, his unit split a single loaf of black bread between 8 men. Today there was nothing. The field kitchen was destroyed that morning, direct hit. The cook killed instantly. No replacement. No fuel. No instructions. When the shouting begins, it comes from everywhere at once. Hindhawk, hands up. Voices in accented German. Boots crashing through brush. The sharp metallic click of rifle bolts being worked. Karl-Heinz freezes. Around him 3 other soldiers, boys really, raise their hands slowly. One of them is crying silently, tears cutting tracks through dust on his cheeks. An American infantryman steps into view. He wears a dusty olive uniform, sleeves rolled up, a cigarette dangling from his mouth. An M1 Garand rests easily in his hands. Behind him come more, helmets netted, faces calm, confident, well-fed. Karl-Heinz notices it immediately. The Americans look solid. Not hollow-eyed. Not gaunt. Their uniforms are worn but clean. Their movements unhurried. Drop the weapons, the American says almost casually. Rifles fall into the dirt. A submachine gun clatters against a rock. The war for Karl-Heinz ends not with a bullet, but with a smell. Coffee. As the prisoners are marched back along the road, Karl-Heinz catches it on the breeze, rich, bitter, unmistakable. He hasn't smelled real coffee since 1942. In Germany, it disappeared long ago, replaced by thin substitutes made from chicory and acorns. His mouth waters involuntarily. They are herded into a temporary enclosure, barbed wire hastily strung between posts. American trucks idle nearby, engines humming. A 2.1/2-ton deuce and a half pulls up, canvas sides flapping. Crates are unloaded. Wooden boxes stamped with white letters. Rations, one guard says to another. Karl-Heinz watches as the Americans break open the crates. Inside are tins, loaves of white bread, cans of meat. Someone tosses a pack of cigarettes to a friend. Another soldier opens a thermos and pours steaming liquid into a cup. Coffee. Again. One of the guards, no older than Karl-Heinz, leans against a truck and eats from a can with a spoon. Meat. Actual meat. Not a thin slice stretched with sawdust filler. Real meat glistening with fat. The prisoners stare. A sergeant notices. He pauses mid-bite, then shrugs and offers a can to one of the Germans through the wire. The prisoner hesitates, suspicious, then takes it. Inside, corned beef. Karl-Heinz feels something twist in his chest, not gratitude, not anger, but disbelief. Back at the front, his division has been living on emergency rations. In July, their daily caloric intake dropped below subsistence. Horses were slaughtered when fuel ran out. By early August, some units were boiling grass and nettles. And here, men who are not even fighting today are eating better than entire German battalions. That night, the prisoners are moved to a larger holding area. They sit on the ground, backs against each other for warmth. Guards patrol the perimeter, joking softly among themselves. One plays a harmonica. Another shares cigarettes. Karl-Heinz listens. The guards complain not about hunger, but about the food being repetitive. Spam again, one mutters. I'd kill for a steak. The words land like a blow. A steak. As a complaint. Karl-Heinz thinks of his last letter from home. His mother wrote about ration cards, about cutting portions smaller, about neighbors collapsing at work. She told him not to worry. That Germany would endure. He stares at the American guards' boots, leather, well-maintained. His own soles are thin, patched twice already. This is when the realization begins, not fully formed but unsettling. If this is how the Americans eat at the edge of the front, what must their rear areas look like? Across France, scenes like this are unfolding thousands of times a day. German soldiers surrender not just to bullets, but to exhaustion and starvation. Their diaries speak of constant hunger, of shrinking rations, of supply columns destroyed before they ever arrive. American guards, meanwhile, operate within a logistical machine that seems inexhaustible. Hot meals are delivered forward. Coffee is brewed daily. Cigarettes are issued as casually as ammunition. For the prisoners, the shock is not merely physical, it is psychological. They were told America was soft, undisciplined, decadent. Yet here in captivity they see something far more dangerous, abundance. Karl-Heinz lies awake that night, staring at the stars through the wire. His stomach is full for the first time in weeks. But his mind is racing. If the enemy can feed guards like this, how much more can they feed their armies? August 13, 1944. Temporary POW Camp, Normandy. Morning comes with the sound of engines and metal clanging. Trucks roll in before sunrise, headlights cutting through mist. The prisoners stir as a smell spreads across the camp. Fried fat, bread warming, coffee boiling in large enamel pots. Karl-Heinz Müller sits up slowly, disbelief already tightening in his chest. He expects thin soup. A ladle of watery broth, perhaps. That is what German POW camps had offered Soviet prisoners. That is what he has been conditioned to expect. Instead, the guards move down the line with crates. Each prisoner receives a tray. White bread. Soft. Real white bread. A slab of meat loaf. Potatoes. And a mug of steaming coffee, dark, fragrant, unmistakably genuine. Karl-Heinz stares at it as if it might vanish. Around him men murmur. One laughs nervously. Another crosses himself. A Feldwebel from an artillery unit whispers, "This is more than we got in Russia on a good day." A guard watches their reaction with mild amusement. "Eat," he says. "You'll need the strength." The words strike Karl-Heinz with unexpected force. You'll need the strength. Not a threat. Not mockery. A matter-of-fact statement. As he eats slowly at first, then faster, Karl-Heinz feels something unfamiliar settle over him, not relief but clarity. The hunger that has dominated every thought for months finally loosens its grip, and with it comes a dangerous awareness. This is not charity. This is policy. Later that morning, the prisoners are marched past an American field kitchen. Large trailers hum as generators run. Cooks work with practiced speed, flipping pans, opening tins, stirring thick stews. Crates are stacked nearby, hundreds of them marked U.S. Army rations. Karl-Heinz catches glimpses of labels, meat and beans. Sugar. Coffee. Chocolate. Chocolate. He remembers when chocolate disappeared in Germany, first from stores, then from the Wehrmacht ration list entirely. By 1944, it exists only as rumor or memory. An American corporal notices his stare and tosses something over. A small brown bar. Wrapped in wax paper. Candy, he says. Don't eat it all at once. Karl-Heinz turns it over in his hands. Chocolate is no longer just food. It is proof. That afternoon, interrogations begin. Not harsh. Not rushed. Karl-Heinz sits across from a lieutenant with a clipboard. The officer offers a cigarette. Real tobacco. Karl-Heinz accepts, hands shaking slightly as he lights it. They talk about units, positions, officers. The lieutenant listens more than he speaks. Between questions, he sips coffee. Always coffee. At one point, the lieutenant glances at Karl-Heinz's thin frame. You boys been eating, he asks. Karl-Heinz hesitates, then answers honestly. No, sir. The lieutenant nods, unsurprised. Figured. No follow-up. No judgment. Just acknowledgement, as if this too had been accounted for in advance. As days pass, the camp becomes more permanent. Barbed wire is reinforced. Tents are erected in neat rows. Latrines dug properly. Water points established. Everything is orderly. Systematic. The prisoners talk among themselves. A sergeant who surrendered near Saint-Tello says his unit had been down to 300 calories a day before capture. A Panzer Grenadier admits they boiled horse harness leather to make soup. Another man confesses he traded his last pair of socks for half a loaf of bread from a French farmer. Then they talk about the Americans. How the guards smoke freely. How trucks arrive on schedule. How food never seems to run out. One prisoner says quietly, if this is how they treat prisoners, imagine how they supply their own men. The thought hangs heavy in the August 20th, 1944. Red Cross inspection. A Swiss observer walks through the camp, clipboard in hand. He checks rations, sanitation, medical care. He speaks to prisoners privately. Karl-Heinz tells him the truth. They are fed better now than they were at the front. The observer nods, making notes. He has heard this before. Many times. What the Red Cross does not record, cannot record, is the morale collapse happening quietly behind the wire. Men who once believed in victory now measure the war in calories. in cigarettes, in coffee cups. They begin to understand that Germany is not losing because of cowardice or betrayal, but because it is starving. That night, Karl-Heinz writes in a small notebook he has kept hidden since 1942. The Americans have more food for their guards than we had for our companies. This is not a lie. I see it every day. One cannot fight an enemy who eats like this. He closes the notebook, heart heavy. The shock is no longer surprise. It is recognition. September 2, 1944. Transport column, northern France. The prisoners move at dawn. A long column under guard, marching toward the rear where rail lines still function. Karl-Heinz Müller carries his small kit, blanket mess tin notebook. He is thin but stronger now. Weeks of regular meals have restored some color to his face. As they pass along the road, American supplied traffic streams the opposite direction. Truck after truck. Ducenday halves nose to tail, engines rumbling steadily. Canvas covers bulge with cargo. White stars mark the doors. Drivers wave casually as they pass. Some chew gum. Some smoke. The column stops to let a convoy roll through. It takes 15 minutes. Karl-Heinz watches, counting unconsciously. 100 trucks. 200. More. Each one represents food, fuel, ammunition, flowing forward without pause. He remembers the last German supply column he saw in July. 12 trucks. Half destroyed by fighter bombers before reaching the front. The rest turned back for lack of fuel. The contrast is unbearable. September 5, 1944. POW rail transport. The prisoners are loaded into freight cars, not cattle cars but refurbished wagons with straw, water barrels and ventilation. Guards ride alongside, not inside. At each stop, hot food is issued. Karl-Heinz sits near the door as the train moves west, deeper into Allied-controlled territory. Through the open slats, he sees something that would once have seemed absurd. A roadside depot. Stacks of crates. Pyramids of fuel drums. Pallets of supplies stretching beyond sight. The train slows. Karl-Heinz leans forward. A sign reads, U.S. Army Quartermaster Depot. The word depot feels inadequate. This is a city. Inside the car, conversation turns quiet, reflective. A former logistics officer, Oberleutnant Friedrich Weber, speaks for the first time since capture. We planned operations around scarcity, he says. Fuel allowances, ammunition limits, ration reductions. He gestures out the door. They plan around abundance. No one argues. Weber explains that by 1944, German divisions on paper bore no resemblance to reality. Authorized rations were fantasies. Fuel tables were irrelevant. Units fought until their supplies vanished, then they froze in place. The Americans, Weber continues, do not fight that way. They move first because they know supplies will follow. Karl-Heinz thinks of the guards complaining about spam. September 12, 1944. U.S. POW Camp, Southern England. After crossing the channel, the prisoners arrive in England. The camp is clean, organized, astonishingly calm. Barracks are wooden but dry. Blankets are issued. Medical inspections are thorough. Then comes the meal. Thick stew. Bread. Vegetables. Tea. A small dessert. The prisoners eat in near silence. Afterward, Karl-Heinz walks the perimeter with another captive, Hans Richter, a former infantryman from the Eastern Front. Hans stops near the wire and looks at the British countryside beyond. I watch men die for potatoes in Ukraine, Hans says quietly. Here they give us dessert. Karl-Heinz has no answer. In the following weeks, the prisoners begin to talk freely, not about tactics or weapons but about scale. They discuss rumors, American factories producing trucks by the tens of thousands. Meat shipments crossing the Atlantic without interruption. Coffee arriving in bulk so large it can be brewed daily at the front. Some refuse to believe it. Others have seen enough. Karl-Heinz recalls a guard explaining casually that his unit rotates fresh food forward every few days. That cold storage ships follow the invasion forces. That supply officers worry more about variety than quantity. Variety. The word sounds obscene. October 3, 1944. Camp Library Hut. Karl-Heinz finds a German-language newspaper printed for POWs. It contains Allied-approved news. He reads about the collapse of German rations, cuts to civilian allowances, bread stretched with fillers, meat nearly gone. It confirms what his body already knows. Germany is not merely losing ground. It is losing the ability to feed itself. That night, Karl-Heinz writes again in his notebook. The guards drink coffee every morning. We drink coffee every morning. This is not because they are kind, it is because they can. The comparison is complete. The shock has deepened into something heavier, an understanding that victory is not decided by bravery alone, but by the quiet, relentless movement of food, fuel, and comfort. And in that movement, America is untouchable. October 21, 1944. U.S. POW Camp, England. Rain drums steadily on the barrack roof. Inside, men sit on bunks, writing letters, cleaning boots, talking in low voices. The war feels distant here, muted, controlled, but it has not left their minds. Karl-Heinz Müller listens as a group gathers near the stove. The topic is familiar now, but still raw. Food. A former ECL base describes his last weeks on the Western Front. We stopped thinking in terms of days, he says. Only meals or the absence of them. Another man nods. Orders didn't matter anymore, hunger decided everything. The room grows quiet. What the Americans have unintentionally done, by feeding prisoners properly, is strip away the last illusion holding these men together. They are no longer numb with starvation. They can think clearly. And clarity is dangerous. In camp classrooms, officers give lectures about democracy, industry, and post-war reconstruction. Attendance is optional, yet many prisoners come. Not out of ideology, but curiosity. An American instructor speaks about production, about real networks, about rationing that still allows abundance. A prisoner raises his hand. Why do your guards eat the same food as your soldiers? The instructor blinks, puzzled. Why wouldn't they? The answer lands harder than any accusation. In the Wehrmacht, hierarchy extended to hunger. Frontline troops often ate worse than rear echelon units. Officers hoarded supplies. Guards went without. Here, equality of provision is taken for granted. For many prisoners, it is their first real exposure to the American system, not as propaganda but as lived reality. November 12, 1944. POW Recreation Yard. Snow dusts the ground lightly. Prisoners play soccer with a stitched leather ball provided by the camp. Laughter breaks out, hesitant at first, then genuine. Karl-Heinz watches from the sidelines. This too is unsettling. Morale, once crushed by hunger, begins to reassemble itself, but in a different direction. Not toward resistance. Toward acceptance. Letters from home arrive sporadically. They speak of bombing raids, shortages, cold apartments. Rations reduced again. Coffee non-existent. The prisoners compare these letters to their own reality. Hans Richter folds his letter carefully. My sister says they had turnip soup 3 days in a row, he says. Here we complain when the stew lacks meat. No one laughs. December 5, 1944. Camp Mess Hall. An American guard sets down his tray across from a group of prisoners during a meal. He is young, relaxed, chewing thoughtfully. Yours any good today, he asks. A prisoner shrugs. Better than yesterday. The guard grins. Yeah, could use more seasoning. That night, Karl-Heinz lies awake, staring at the wooden rafters. He tries to imagine the German army continuing to fight without fuel, without food, without reserves. He cannot. The morale collapse does not come with shouting or mutiny. It comes quietly through comparison. Through the daily reminder that the enemy system works, effortlessly, repeatedly. January 2, 1945. POW Camp Notice Board. News is posted, German forces have launched a major counteroffensive in the Ardennes. The prisoners crowd around the notice. For a brief moment, hope flickers. Then details emerge. Fuel shortages. Captured American depots being raided for gasoline. German units halted not by enemy fire, but by empty tanks. Karl-Heinz steps back from the board, the meaning clear. Even when Germany attacks, it does so with borrowed supplies. Later in his notebook, Karl-Heinz writes his final wartime entry. We believed discipline could replace food, courage could replace fuel, faith could replace factories. We were wrong. The shock that began with a cup of coffee has matured into certainty. The war is already decided. The guns simply have not stopped yet. April 14, 1945. U.S. POW Camp, England. Spring comes softly. Grass returns to the yard. The barbed wire still stands, but it feels less oppressive now, less like a cage, more like a boundary marking time. Karl-Heinz Müller sits at a rough wooden table, reading a posted bulletin in German. Allied forces are deep inside the Reich. Cities he recognizes are listed one after another. Cologne. Frankfurt. Leipzig. Each name lands with a dull weight. Around him, prisoners speak openly now. No one lowers their voice anymore. There is no point. A former Luftwaffe mechanic shakes his head slowly. They didn't just beat us in the air, he says. They outfit us. No one disagrees. May 8, 1945. POW Camp Assembly Area. The announcement is brief, formal, almost understated. Germany has surrendered. For a moment there is silence. Then scattered reactions, some men sit down, others stare ahead blankly. A few cry. No one shouts. Karl-Heinz feels neither relief nor despair. Only a strange calm. The war, in truth, ended for him months ago, not with surrender papers but with a tray of white bread and a mug of coffee. That was when he understood. In the weeks that follow, Allied officers conduct interviews. Historians, intelligence staff, psychologists. They ask about morale, logistics, breakdowns at the front. Karl-Heinz answers carefully. When did you realize the war was lost? One officer asks. Karl-Heinz thinks of Normandy. Of the American guard leaning against a truck, eating meat from a can. Of complaints about food variety. After capture, he says, when I saw how your guards lived. The officer looks up. Your guards. Karl-Heinz nods. Not your generals, not your frontline heroes, your guards. The officer writes that down. 1946. Germany. Karl-Heinz returns home thinner than he should be, but alive. His mother weeps when she sees him. His sister listens silently as he tells his story. When he describes the American camps, the food, the cigarettes, the coffee, his sister shakes her head. That cannot be true, she says. Karl-Heinz does not argue. He opens a cupboard and sees what remains of the household ration. Dried bread, ersatz flour, nothing else. He understands her disbelief. Years later, former prisoners will record the same shock in memoirs and testimonies. Again and again the theme repeats, not cruelty, not humiliation, but abundance. They were defeated not only by tanks and aircraft, but by a system that could feed its enemies better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. History will remember battles, names, dates. But for those who lived it, the truth was simpler. You cannot fight when you are starving. You cannot win when the enemy eats without thinking about it. And when German POWs watched American guards drink coffee every morning, fresh, hot, unlimited, they did not just lose faith in victory. They understood with sudden and irreversible clarity that the war had been decided far beyond the front lines.